Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's my absolute privilege now to introduce our third guest for today, Lieutenant Colonel John Dagless. Colonel John joined the Army in 1997 and has had an illustrious career to date, serving a number of years with airborne forces and a breadth of operational experience in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Why is he here today? When he was a student on the Advanced Command and Staff College, he wrote a paper on toxic leadership, which gained real traction and was subsequently published. And Colonel John has spoken on numerous occasions across defence and wider on the issue of toxic leadership. And in line with the question I posed to CFA this morning, it is a topical issue and a perennial issue that this organisation has to deal with at all levels. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant Colonel John Dagless. John, over to you.
Good morning. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are around the world. I've worked for a toxic leader. They were selfish, narcissistic. It was all about them. To my shame, I conformed. A valiant and courageous colleague stood up to this toxic leader, and the whole system turned upon them. Now, I'm conscious, talking to the Science Mess, that we have many stars in the audience, people that have succeeded and done great things, and hopefully live by our values and standards. The paper I did, that Langley's just talked about, was published both across the fence, informed part of the Army Leadership Doctrine, which the Command Sergeant Major has referred to, and has been published wider. It was very much a self-journey for me to work out why I behaved the way I did, but also the response of the organisation, our culture, and our leadership approach. To start off with then, I believe the two defining characteristics of what I believe toxic leadership to be is very much that poisonous relationship that the leader has with their subordinates, be that deliberate or sometimes accidental. And also that the toxic leader's underlying motive is generally generated through self-interest and not that by their team or the individuals that they have the privilege to command. It's an antithesis to selfish leadership. It's selfish leadership. The thing you'll find, and hopefully I'll conclude with at the end, the danger with the term toxic leadership is it is a label, and labels are definitive. And I think from what we've already heard this morning, they are not as black and white, not as conclusive as perhaps we might wish to consider. To consider the background though, the British military as a Department of State is uncomfortable about talking about poor and underperforming leadership because it's something inherently intrinsic to our organisation. It's one of the principal things that we seek to be good and professionalise at. And so we are uncomfortable because any failure in leadership is seen as a failure not only of the organisation, but also potentially our cultures. However, every time there is a failing, an inquiry, or whatever else, quite often we look and criticise both our leadership and cultural flaws. There is a perception in the military and wider that selfish leadership is still a problem, and even recent studies and surveys conducted by the CAL and others continue to see that. And also, we don't necessarily always really understand the problems of negative leadership. Hopefully this presentation will help in that, nor do we measure the cost. Now, I say we don't measure the cost because it really has an impact on the moral components. The Command Sergeant Major talked about the components of command earlier on, and it erodes the trust agenda. And it erodes the trust agenda not just with the individuals, but actually it can go wider than that in terms of the way a team performs, but also our relationship with other people, our families, and all the rest of it. So whilst we don't necessarily measure it, there is evidence out there that there is still a challenge, whether that be the number of people that don't report issues, but also that trust relationship, that trust agenda between our leadership and our senior leadership and ourselves and our messes, be that the officers' mess, sergeant's mess, or corporal's mess. One of the reasons I say that we're uncomfortable with it is that negative leadership is an oxymoron. Leadership is seen to be a good thing because we all hopefully believe in the selfless leadership model. And indeed, the one thing that I always remind myself when I come back to Sandhurst is that underlying motto of serve to lead. Something that I certainly didn't really appreciate or understand as an officer cadet, but I do now. And it doesn't matter whether you serve in the dark blue, light blue, or in the army, or in the civil service, or wider across defence. Certainly all our leadership is always seen to be positive. We have the processes and procedures in place. I'm not excusing or defending people that have robust leadership styles, because there is a place and there is a need for that. And indeed, the whole, as our Army doctrine talks about, transformational and transactional leadership, and CFA himself talked about, you know, that point of contact on the battlefield and the importance of being able to grip and deliver. But it's that element where people can use and exploit what is a privileged position, particularly when we look at rank. So I've defined up front what I believe toxic leadership to be. In one of the most insightful publications by a Colonel Denise Williams, she talked about a spectrum of leadership failure. And indeed, in our doctrine, we talk about a spectrum of leadership styles as well. And toxic leadership or bad leadership is a personal thing. Again, if you were in the room, I would ask individuals to see where they would draw the line personally, whether it be from the incompetent all the way through to the those that have real malevolent tendencies. And around this spectre of toxicity is a huge industry, both in industry and in the military, in terms of, you know, what do we do about bad leaders, and how can we make bad leaders good? Because one of the things that bad leaders normally do, or the good bad leader, again, that sounds like an oxymoron, they achieve results. They achieve results. Now, in this wealth of literature, they tend to talk about the psychology of leadership and people's behaviour. And certainly they see a spectrum of psychological conditions where people become more and more self-interested and exploitative. That leads us to one of the bits that our doctrine refers to in terms of, it talks about this dark triad and the various behaviours that people have in terms of narcissism, self-obsessed, people that lack empathy, such as the psychopath, but also the type of behaviour that people will undertake, where means justify the ends. And indeed, every so often in the national papers and wider, there'll be various articles that talk about particularly psychopaths and narcissists as to why they are good leaders, because they achieve results, because they have great power thrust upon them, and they deliver. The one thing that they do lack, though, or tend to lack, is that emotional intelligence, that ability to really connect and serve and work with those under their command. So, noting the Command Sergeant Major's sort of emphasis on rank, I just wanted to sort of just pause just for a minute in terms of using your rank and your position to help those under your command and tutelage. And power itself is quite an interesting thing. There are many different forms of power and types of power. And certainly one of the things I would ask for you to do in terms of self-reflection is, in the military, as a hierarchical organisation, we often think principally of our rank, because with that position comes status. And of course, there is that saying that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But actually, all of you as individuals, whether you be junior members of the mess or senior members of the mess actually have wider power within yourselves and in your situation. Kirk himself talks very much about the social connections, particularly in the military, and that's quite important because actually that not only can aid a toxic commander to succeed, but actually the organisation will work with poor leadership in order to still meet the ends, to still succeed, to still win in battle. The other thing I would point to on this slide, and again it's come up earlier on today, is the power of personality. You read any leadership book, and the importance of personality, that connection with those under your command, is absolutely key and central. So why does negative leadership reside in the army? It's great to have a colleague joining us from the Australian Army, because actually a few years ago, General Orr did a study into poor behaviour within the Australian military, and he found that the risks of poor leadership are much greater in the military than in civil organisations because of our constructs, because of our deference to rank, because of the chain of command and the flow of information. And he was very insightful in the work that he wrote. And actually, whilst there are fewer studies in broader society, we mirror society. And in terms of percentages of people that have seen or worked for negative leaders, actually we mirror society. Quite often figures are as high as 80 or 90% in terms of seeing poor leadership. And even recent studies still show those sorts of statistics. Now, I'm not going to suggest that every leader is poor or manipulative. And what these studies don't necessarily do is highlight whether it's a few bad people that people are aware of or lots of bad people. I'd like to think it's the former. But again, it's always something as a learning organisation that we do reflect on. And because people and leadership is so central to everything we do, it's absolutely something that we continue to interrogate and continue to seek to achieve to do better. So in the Army Leadership Doctrine, there is a piece in the back about the potential toxic triangle. This is my own personal toxic triangle from the study that I did. The one in the back of the doctrine handbook is slightly different. I'm not going to dwell and use time to talk through each individual circle, but to draw through a couple of particular reasons why negative leaders can succeed. Under the leader, absolutely, rank has its privilege. Military leaders are a product of their environment, and so they are seen and encouraged to do well, both from those in the various messes that support them, but also the hierarchy that works around them. And it's encouraging to hear CFA today talk about how he recognises that personally and what he's personally doing about that. But also I think what we've heard today, and is still very much the case, whether we look at our historic examples, we do tend to err to strong and heroic and visionary leaders, because those are the leaders that will succeed on the battlefield. And we need to continue to have those people. And so there is that tension. As CSFA raised this morning, that ability to act and be decisive in times of crisis is absolutely critical. The environment. We are a performance-driven organisation. You just have to look at your S jar or your O jar, and it starts with performance, performance, performance. Leaders drive for success. Leaders drive to deliver results. And so that's something that we need to be aware of. Likewise, our short-term posting cycles allow us to tolerate people. And more importantly, and this is a really important message for those, those out there in your sergeant messes, is poor leaders are harder to identify from the top down. And so your support in educating, in nurturing, and correcting is absolutely key, because you get to see things at a level that those above the poor leaders don't necessarily always get to see. And then there's the followers. We have a really important part here as well, both as leaders and followers. The military's culture to deference of rank goes without question, and there's a reason for that. However, we also have a very strong anti-whistleblowing culture. We have a loyalty to our chain of command, and even though we might support a friend who is in difficulty, ultimately we have a loyalty to the wider organisation as well. Now, absolutely, as the Army Doctrine talks about, there are those that are conformers and those that are colluders. It's those that are colluders, that's the most poisonous and vexatious thing that we must root out. Emulating and copying poor leadership styles because you get the rewards of rank, because you get the rewards of being seen to succeed, must be driven out in all of our messes. Some of you may be familiar with things like the Stanley-Milligan experiments, where there's a natural obedience to authority, and then there's an element of social conformity as well. And Philip Zimbardo also talks about this group behaviour. What we can't ever allow is that those poor behaviour traits become acceptable in the works that we do. So what? If the military wishes to deal with toxic leadership, we've got to understand it, define it, and act. And certainly our doctrine, is tackling that, and forums like this also help. We've got to acknowledge that negative leadership erodes the values and standards that we see very much as our vital ground, and key to success on the battlefield, but also at home. But acknowledge that bad leaders get results. They absolutely get results. And any decision or indecision will have implications. The term toxic leadership is a label. Be very, very careful branding people with that. As good as well as bad leaders will continue to be branded as toxic by subordinates who question their leaders' actions and motives. That won't go away. Finally, help is out there. When I worked for a toxic leader, the ombudsman didn't exist. The challenge process didn't exist. There are forums out there now that are there to help you. And as I say, the actual policies are all there in place as well. Get a buddy, distance yourself if there is somebody there. Use your peer network, and absolutely, as a sergeant's mess, please help in rooting that out. And if all else fails, report it as well. That's me. Thank you very much.
John, hey, thank you very much indeed. That's exactly what we were hoping for and expecting. As I said at the beginning and alluded to with CFA, toxic leadership is a perennial issue that gets discussed by all ranks, certainly when the crowd engages. And as you alluded to, there's been a number of surveys over the last few years that highlight this. This is still an issue. But as both yourself and CFA alluded to, toxic leadership is not black and white. It's a complicated issue. And I think the first thing we need to tackle collectively is, what do we actually mean by that term? And I think some of the language you're using there about failures of leadership, about negative, perhaps at worst case, destructive leadership, those are sort of terms that may help us unpack it, and understand it on a spectrum is really, really useful. Also acknowledging that the very nature of our organisation does create some barriers, as alluded to in the Australian report you mentioned there. And again, how do we counteract some of those barriers that are institutional? But what you've also done is very usefully highlighted what role we can all play as leaders at all levels, but particularly pertinent to the seniors those here in the audience. And if nothing else, I think today is about drawing out that discussion. What do we mean by toxic leadership? What does it mean for you as individuals? How can you relate to it from your own experience? And I really like the honesty that you opened up with on your first few sentences there from your own personal experiences. And I'm sure we've all got similar experiences where, for good or ill, we perhaps didn't react the way we ought to have in light of seeing toxic leadership at some point throughout our career, and exists at all ranks. However you define it, there's poor leadership, failure to leadership, I believe, at all ranks. We can't be too hard on ourselves. I do believe as an organisation, consistently believe we have excellent leadership at all levels. And as an organisation, we are often seen as the gold standard across many other sectors. That said, it still pervades as a problem. We need to get after it. So thank you, John, for engaging us on this today. And I urge the audience to take this subject away for further debate and discussion. So, John, thank you very much indeed.